We continue now at the top of Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph in Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 21a. On the previous summer, there was a contradiction when one sells a house in a walled city. Is the halacha that you can redeem it halfway or not? The Gemara had initially said, according to Rabbi Shimon, that you could redeem it halfway, and the reason that was given was because since we say over there that there's actually a disadvantage that the seller has, because if the seller doesn't redeem it within that first year, so he's not able to get it back, so because of that disadvantage, we also give the seller an advantage that he can redeem it halfway. We also give him another advantage that he can borrow and redeem, and the contradiction was the Brisa seems to say the opposite. The Brisa says that he's not able to borrow and redeem, and he's not able to redeem it halfway. And the Gemara now says it's not difficult. Harabbanan, Harabi Shimon. In one case, the Brisa which says he's not able to redeem it halfway, that follows the Rabbanan, and it was Rabbi Shimon, like we said before. Rabbi Shimon is the one that says he is able to redeem it halfway. And Rashi explains, Harabbanan de lo yahavi taimu l'kra. The idea over here is that the Rabbanan, they don't pay attention to the reason behind the psukim. V'amri dehora kocho b'chodamil. So they say, if he has a disadvantage in one regard, horanami b'milsa acharisa, it makes sense to say that he has disadvantage in another regard. Bar mehecha degali beikra, unless you have a situation where the pasuk says otherwise, you assume if he has a disadvantage here, he has a disadvantage somewhere else. Rabbi Shimon would not say that, because Rabbi Shimon says that the whole idea is we're darshin on time of dekra. We look for the reason in the pasuk, and the idea is, let's say by a stei achuza, by an ancestral field, which goes back to the original owner anyhow, and we really want fields to go to their original owner. So at the Yovel year, it's going to go back anyhow. So we don't have to give any advantages in terms of the redemption. Whereas by Batei Orechomer, Rabbi Shimon would say, no, you have to give some advantages to the redemption, because here, if the person doesn't redeem it, they're going to lose that field. It's going to go completely to the buyer. Again, according to the Rabbanan, you just learn from stei achuza, and that's it. We don't look for the reason behind it. And that which we said, that by a house in the walled city that you do have these leniencies, he can borrow and redeem halfway. Rabbi Shimon that goes only according to Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon is trying to examine the reason behind the psukim, and therefore he says again that over here by Batei Orechoma, where if he doesn't redeem it, it's going to go to the buyer completely. So there's reason to be lenient and say that it's possible to borrow and redeem, and it's possible to redeem halfway. And the Gemara continues along the same lines. Tani Chada, we learned in one brayso, love of v'goel lechatzoyin, that when it comes to Batei Orechoma, he is able to borrow and redeem halfway. But Tan Yidach, and another brayso says, Ein love of v'goel lechatzoyin, he's not able to borrow and redeem, and he's not able to redeem halfway. And again, the Gemara says, Lokash, it's not difficult. Harabbanan, Rabbi Shimon. In one case, it's the Rabbanan, they're strict, and Rabbi Shimon is the one who is lenient. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Ravacha B'rei Derava Ravashi, Ravacha B'rei Derava said to Ravashi, Ikol Mifrach, we can refute the limud on the previous Amud. Rashi explains, Ikol Mifrach B'hamas Nisan Da'atzrucha Krola Makdish, Sheyilva V'yigol Mishum Da'asyale Medina Shal Mocher Bayis B'Yerchoma, She'ein Lava V'gol. On the previous Amud, we brought a brisa that said that we need a pasuk to teach us that when somebody is makdish his field, the pasuk teaches us that he's allowed to borrow and redeem, and also again that he's allowed to redeem halfway. And the reason why we needed a pasuk is because otherwise we would have learned it out from Mocher Bayis B'Yerchoma. We would have learned it out from the case of someone who sells a house in a walled city. We would have learned out from there that he's not allowed to borrow and redeem. And so the Gemara now is asking, but you can refute that limud, this limud from Mocher Bayis Be'ir Choma to the case of the Makdish Sadeh, you can refute it. And you can refute it as follows. Malamocher Bayis Be'batei Orechoma, what do we find by someone who sells a house in a walled city? Shekein Hora Kocho Ligoy Liolam, that when it comes to the house in the walled city, as we said before, there the person has a disadvantage because he's not able to redeem forever. He only has that first year to redeem. Rashi says, Malamocher Bayis B'Yerchoma Shekein Hora Kocho Ligo Liolam. He has a disadvantage. He can't redeem forever. Mishana Rishona Ve'elach, meaning from the first year and on. Once the first year passes, so he's not able to redeem at all. And so maybe that's why we say specifically over there by the Bayis Batei Orechoma. That's why you're not allowed to borrow and redeem. Tomer v'makdish, whereas by makdish, sheyafakochu, he has an advantage. Ligol olam, he's able to redeem forever. And Rashi explains, Tomer v'makdish sheyafakochu ligol liolam liolam shel yovel, meaning liolam shel yovel, meaning all the way until the yovel time, you're able to redeem by makdish sadeu. Imlo mochra hagizbor, if it wasn't sold by the gizbor, then mischalekes lekohanim at yovel. The point is, it's not divided up among the kohanim until the yovel, and so therefore, how is it that we were able to learn out from mocher bayis b'batei orechoma to the case of Makdish Sadeyu? And the Gemara continues, Amalei Ravacha Saba Ravashi. Ravacha Saba said to Ravashi, Mishum Di'ikol Memar. The reason why we were able to learn it out from Mocher Bayis B'Batei Rechoma is because you could say Nahader didn't go back and have a limud like a Tzad Hashava. Teisi B'Meh Hatzad. You can learn it out from a Mahatzad. That's the Tzad Hashava, the common denominator now between Mocher Bayis B'Batei Rechoma and Mocher Steachuza. That Mocher Steachuza Yochiach. That Mocher Steachuza, one who sells his ancestral field, that'll prove the other way. Because over there the person also has the advantage, he can redeem forever. And they're also not able to borrow and redeem, not able to redeem halfway, and so therefore learning it out from the Stei Achuza, there we could have learned out to the case of Makdish Sodeu. But that also you could try to refute. What do we find by a person who sells his ancestral field? So there he has a disadvantage that he's not able to redeem immediately. As we said, you have to wait 2 years. But then we'll say back, Mocher Bayis B'Batei Arechoma Yochiach. When one sells his house in a walled city, that can prove the other way. You are able to redeem immediately. V'Chazer Adin, and we go back and forth. Lo Roi Zeh Karoi Zeh. This one is not like this one, and the other one is not like that one. Meaning to say again, each one has something unique. Hatzad Hashaveh Shevahen, the common denominator between the case of Mocher Stei Achuza and the case of Mocher Bayis B'Batei Arechoma, Shenigolen, in both cases they can be redeemed. Ve'ein Love V'Goel V'Goel Lechatza, and he's not allowed to borrow and redeem. He's not allowed to redeem halfway. Afani avi makdish, and so therefore that's why the Brisa said earlier. I would have said that by makdish as well. Shenigal ve'in love v'goel lechatzayin. It's something that's redeemable, but you can't borrow and redeem, and you can't redeem halfway. And that's what it meant earlier on the previous summon when we were learning out from these cases to makdish. And that's why you need a pasuk to say that vimgol yigal, that you could borrow and redeem, you could redeem halfway. But the Gemara still says, Amarle Marzutra Breder Rav Mori Ravina. Marzutra, the son of Rav Mori, said to Ravina, Ikol Mifrach, you can still refute even the common denominator. Because Mala Atzad Hashaveh Shaven, because what's unique about the Tzad Hashaveh? What common denominator did these two cases have, by Stei Achuza and by Bayis Batei Rechoma? Shekain Hora Kocham Ligoel B'Shana Shniya. They both have a disadvantage that there's no redemption in the second year. And the reason for that is by an ancestral field, you can only start redeeming it after the second year. And when it comes to the house that's in the walled city, you only have the first year to redeem it, so you can't redeem it in the second year. So they both share that disadvantage. Tomer b'makdish, whereas when it comes to the case of makdish sada, sheyafa kochel ligol b'shana shniya, there he has the advantage. He's able to redeem it in the second year, and so therefore even to learn out from the combination of the two cases, you can't really do. The Gemara says, Amarle Ravina said to him, Mishum De'ikol Amemar, no, in terms of that disadvantage, you can respond as follows, Eved Ivri hanimkar lo'ovet kochavim yochiach, that an Eved Ivri who sold to a non-Jew will prove the other way, Sheyafa kochel ligoel b'shana shniya, because in that case there is the advantage of being able to redeem in the second year, Vein love v'goel lechatzayin, and in that case also, you can't borrow and redeem, and you can't redeem halfway, and so we can learn it out from the common denominator, so to speak, between all three of the cases, to the case of Makdish Sadeyu. And the Gemara continues, Boy minei Rav Huna bar Chinana me Rav Sheshes. Rav Huna bar Chinana asked from Rav Sheshes the following question: Hamocher bayis bebotei arichom. If somebody sells a house in a walled city, nigal lekrovim or nigal lekrovim, is it redeemed by relatives or is it not redeemed by relatives? Rashi explains, nigal bekrovim al karcho shalokech, meaning against the will of the purchaser, that a relative is going to come in and redeem it. Kide eshkechon b'stei achuza. We find this is true by stei achuza, by the ancestral field, and that's why we're asking it by the house in the walled city. It says by the stei achuza v'goalo hakarov ela v'gomer. It says that again the person who's a relative is going to come to redeem it, and so therefore he's asking again: is it nigal lekrovim or nigal lekrovim by the house in the walled city? Is that redeemed by the relatives or not? Geulaso mistei achuza gomar. On the one hand, we have a gzeir shav. It says geulaso both by bayis but rechom and by stei achuza. We should learn out from stei achuza. Mas stei achuza eina nigelis lechatzoin v'nigelis lekrovim. Just like the stei achuza, it's not redeemed halfway, but it is redeemed by relatives. Afainami, so too when it comes to the house in the walled city, ein nigal lechatzoin, it's not redeemed halfway, v'nigal lekrovim, but it is redeemed by relatives. Odilma, or maybe kiksiva geula bechatzoin hu dechsiv. When does it say the word geula that we're making this gezeira shave? We're connecting the case of bayis v'batei rechom and stei achuza. That gezeira shave geulaso, that's specifically by the halacha of redeeming it halfway. Bekarovim lo ksib, but it's not written by the halacha of a relative coming and redeem, and therefore we don't compare the two cases in terms of the halachas of relatives. And the Gemara says, Amarle said to him, Eino nigal, it is not redeemed by the relatives when it comes to the house in the walled city. And the Gemara continues, Eisvei, we have the following question. It says in the Braisa, B'chol Geula Titnu, it says, with all, there's going to be this redemption. L'rabos botim v'avid ivri. That comes to include the concept of Geula, of redemption, when it comes to houses and when it comes to avid ivri, both are redeemed. And so the Gemara now says, what do we mean by houses? My lav, botei orechoma, don't we mean to say houses in the walled cities? And the idea would be that it's coming to include even redemption with relatives. And the Gemara says, no, that's not what we're talking about. Botei chatzeirim. We're actually talking about the houses in the unwalled cities. The Gemara says, Botei chatzeirim, if you're talking about the houses in the unwalled cities, behed yiksibu, it already says that explicitly, that they're the same as ste'achuza. It says, al stei ha'aretz yechashiv, they are counted among the fields of the land. And so therefore you wouldn't need to have a pasuk to include those kind of houses. And the Gemara says, Hahu lakova chova. The Gemara says here, when it talks about b'chol geula titnu, it's actually to make it that it's an obligation upon the relatives to redeem. V'aliva de Rabbi Eliezer, this is following the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says that it's actually an obligation. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso of V'goalas mim karachav, it talks about redeeming. He redeems that which was sold by his brother. Reshus, that's only voluntary. You don't have to do it. Ata omer reshus oeno elachova. You're saying it's something that's voluntary. Maybe it's an obligation. Talmud lomer v'ishki lo yeh lo goel. The pasuk says that if a person doesn't have someone to redeem it for him, v'chiyesh adam b'Yisrael she'ein lo goelim. Is there anyone in Klal Yisrael without someone to redeem, without some relative? Elazeh sheyesh lo ve'eno rotza likach. Obviously, what it means is it's somebody who does have a relative, but the relative doesn't want to purchase, doesn't want to redeem. Sharashos biyadu, it's something that's voluntary. He doesn't have to do it. That's what the pasuk means when he has no one to redeem. Divrei Rabbi Yoshua, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, that it's all voluntary. However, Rabbi Eliezer says, V'golas mim karachav chova. When it says he's going to redeem, the relative is going to come to redeem, it's an obligation. Ata omer chova, you're saying that it's an obligation. Oeno ela reshus, maybe it's something that's voluntary. Talmud lomer v'chol geula titnu, that's the pasuk we quoted earlier. That's what the pasuk means when it says b'chol geula titnu, that there has to be this redemption. Hakasav kavu chova. The pasuk is saying that it is an obligation, and that's what that pasuk is coming for. And Rashi explains, B'chol geula titnu, again that pasuk comes to include relatives, Uv'chol eretz achuzaschem geula titnu la'aretz. The pasuk says that in all of your land there's going to be this redemption, Kro Yiseiru, that's an extra pasuk. V'lo perish l'mayasa, doesn't explain what the pasuk is coming for. L'rabos botim v'avid ivri, so the Brisa said that it comes to include houses and avid ivri, she'yihun negolin l'krovim, that they're redeemed by relatives. And so again, the Gemara had asked, what kind of houses are we talking about? Aren't we talking about houses in the walled cities? You see that there is a concept of redeeming by relatives, and then the Gemara says, no, we're talking about Botei HaChatzerim, we're talking about Ayoros She'ein Mukafas Choma, Miyamos Yoshua. We're talking about cities that were not surrounded by walls from the days of Yehoshua. And the Gemara said, well, if we're talking about Botei Chatzerim, we already know that's considered like a ste'achuza. It says, Al stei ha'aretz yechashiv, it says that's counted like the fields of the land, Harein keste'achuza, that's considered like the ste'achuza. And the Gemara then answered that the pasuk of B'chol geula titnu is l'kovo chova l'krovim, to make it that it's an obligation on the relatives to redeem in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. V'chiyesh loch adam b'Yisrael, Rabbi Yoshua said, is there any person in Klal Yisrael who doesn't have relatives? Minot lechelek baretz, meaning anyone who took a portion in the land, she'ein lo goel, and who doesn't have someone who can redeem. If you're talking about somebody with an ancestral field, that's somebody who took a portion in the land, there must be a relative. Mizeri Yaakov bod echad mikol Yisrael kayim hu karav lo, there's nobody that's a relative, there must be somebody that's a relative. And so Rabbi Yoshua says what it means in the pasuk when it says lo yeh lo goel, ela yesh lo goel, and it really means he has someone who can redeem for him. Avalein hagoel rod salikach, but the redeemer doesn't want to purchase it. According to Rabbi Yoshua, the pasuk is teaching that it's something that's voluntary in terms of the relative. Chova, but Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. He says it's an obligation. V'haiki lo yeh lo goel dorish. Now, what does Rabbi Eliezer do with the pasuk of that he doesn't have a redeemer? Doesn't everyone have a relative? He darshans as follows: B'shi efsher biyad haroi liyarsha ligoel. What it means is, let's say it's impossible. The one who inherits the individual is not able to redeem it. Ve'ein hageula mutelas ela al hakarov min hakol. So then the pasuk is saying that the redemption is going to go to the person who's the closest relative. And the Gemara continues, Amri le Rabbanan le Ravashi, the Rabbanan said to Ravashi, V'amri lo Ravina le Ravashi, and some say it's Ravina that said to Ravashi, B'shalom l'man damar le Rabos botei arichom. I understand according to the one who says that when the pasuk says V'chol eretz achuzaschem geula titnu la'aretz, so it comes to include the houses in the walled cities, Hainu dichsiv bakol, that's why it says bakol in all, and we're including some other case. Elalaman damar l'rabos batei chatzerim. But according to the one who says that we're including the houses in the unwalled cities, so my bakol. So why does it say bakol in all cases? Really, that's already automatically included. As we said, the houses in the unwalled cities are considered to be, they're yechashev, they're considered to be like the stei achuza anyway. So you wouldn't need the word bakol if that's all we're coming to include. And to that the Gemara says kasha. The Gemara says indeed that is difficult. And Rashi says, "My bakol nichtov geula titnu la'aretz." It could just say the redemption should be for the land. That automatically includes batei chatzerim. You don't have to say uvechol eretz achuzaschem geula titnu la'aretz. And again, the Gemara leaves that as a kasha. And as Tosas explained, "My bakol lichtov geula titnu la'aretz." Again, it could just say geula titnu la'aretz. V'shaminon stei achuza lekovo chova. We already know that the ancestral field, it's an obligation for the relative. Uvatei chatzerim bechlal. You should already automatically include the houses in the unwalled cities. You don't need an extra word in the pasuk to include them. That's automatically included in stei achuza. And so that's why again the Gemara had asked. It seems like it is including it is including the houses in the walled cities, and the Gemara left that as a question. And the Gemara continues, Eitzvei Abaya. Abaya asks the following question from a Brisa. The Brisa says, Matam and Lomer Yigolenu, 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 Gimel Pa'amim. Why does the pasuk say Yigolenu 3 times? Rashi says, Matam and Lomer B'Evid Ivri Hanimkar La'Ovid Kochavim. We're talking here about an Evid Ivri that's sold to a non-Jew. It says Yigolenu 3 times. Why? L'Rabos Kol HaGeulos Shanigolos Keseder Hazeh. It's to include all kinds of redemptions that they should be in this order. Rashi says, L'Rabos Kol HaGeulos Ha'omdos Ligol, meaning anything that is said to be redeemed, Shehei Nigal Keseder Hazeh, should be redeemed in this fashion. Kasal Kadaitach Shehu Nigolin Lekrovim Bolol Amdeinu. Right now we think it's teaching us this exact halacha, the idea of redeeming with relatives, and it's saying all geulos, there should be a concept of redeeming with relatives. My love, is it not saying Bote Orechoma ve'Evid Ivri? We're talking about houses in the walled cities, and we're saying houses in the walled cities are redeemed by relatives. That goes against what we said before, and also talking about an Evid Ivri that's sold to a Jew. Rashi says ve'Evid Ivri Hanimkor LiYisrael Delo Ksiv Begulas Krovim. When an Evid Ivri is sold to a Jew, it doesn't talk about redemption by relatives. So aren't we talking about those 2 cases again? And you see there is redemption by relatives in these cases. And the Gemara answers, Lo, no, that's not what we're talking about over here when we include all redemptions, Keseder Hazeh. We're talking about Batei Chatzerim Ustei Achuzah. We're talking about the houses in the unwalled cities, and we're talking about the ancestral fields. That's what we're talking about in terms of the redemption by relatives. The Gemara says, Batei Chatzerim Ustei Achuzah B'Ed Yiksiv. When it comes to the houses in the unwalled cities and the ancestral fields, again, that's an explicit pasuk. It says, Al Stei Ha'aretz Yechashev. It says that the Batei Chatzerim are considered to be just like the Stei Achuzah. It's the same thing. And the Gemara says, Kedam Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, it's like Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said in a different context, he said, L'karov Karov Kodem. He said, we always go to the closest relative first. That's the one that has precedence. Hachanami, so here also, L'karov Karov Kodem. We always go to the closest relative. And Rashi says, L'karov Karov Kodem, the Gabe Stei Achuza, Ksiv, because by the Stei Achuza, by the ancestral field, the pasuk says, Uva Goalo HaKarov Elav. It just says the relative comes. V'lo Perish HaKarov Karov Kodem. It doesn't explain that the closest relative always has precedence. Kihacha, like it says over here, meaning to say over here, when we're talking about the Evid Ivri that's sold to the non-Jew, the parish dodo bereisha, v'yemein lo dod ben dodo, v'ilav misher besaro. It goes in order of closest relatives, and it lists off, if not this person, if not the uncle, then it should be the son of the uncle, etc., etc. And so therefore, that's what we're learning when we're learning from the case, l'rabos kol ha'geulos shenegolos kaseder hazeh. When we're learning from the case of an Evid Ivri that's sold to an Ovid Kochavim, we're saying the concept of Karov Kodem that applies to the Stei Achuzah and that applies to Batei Chatzerim. And the Gemara says, Heicha Itmar de Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. This statement of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak was in another context of Karov Kodem. Where did Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak originally say the statement? Aha, he said it on the following. The boy lahu, because they asked the following question. Evid Ivri hanimkar liyisrael, if you have an Evid Ivri that's sold to a Jew, nigal lekrovim, oeno nigal lekrovim, is he redeemed by relatives, or is he not redeemed by relatives? This is a similar question to the question we had by the houses in the walled cities. They had a similar question by Evid Ivri that's sold to a Jew. And the Gemara says, Aliba de Revi lo tiboilach. According to Rebbe, it shouldn't even be a question to you. Diyamar misha eno nigal be'ela nigal b'sheish, because Rebbe says somebody who's not redeemed with these is going to be redeemed after 6 years. Al malo mifrak, you see that there's no redemption by relatives. Rashi explains, misha eno nigal be'ela nigal b'sheish, al mosvir le de'ein nigal b'krovim. In other words, it means to say, what he's saying is somebody who's not redeemed through relatives instead goes out after 6 years. That's exactly what Rebbe is saying, is that ein nigal b'krovim, there is no redemption by relatives when it comes to the Eved Ivri that's sold to the Jew. And so it's clear from the statement of Rebbe that it's eino nigal l'krovim. Kisi boilach, when is it a question to you? I'll leave it to Rabbanan. It's a question according to the Rabbanan. What's the halacha? Yalfinon sacher v'lo darshi yigalenu. Do we make a gezerah shava sacher? We say that an Eved Ivri sold to a Jew is the same thing as an Eved Ivri that's not sold to a Jew, and therefore there is redemption by relatives. And we don't darshan yigalenu that redemption only applies, redeem only in this case of an Eved Ivri that goes to a non-Jew. Rashi explains yigalenu ksib benimkar lovet kochav, and the word yigalenu is by an Eved Ivri sold to a non-Jew, gabe krovim by the relatives, that there's redemption by relatives. Mashma miyuta, that sounds like an exclusion, that we're saying only over here there's relatives. We don't say that. On the one hand, we say no, sacher, there's a gezerah shava, a comparison between the two cases, and we say that there's redemption by relatives also by an Eved Ivri sold to a Jew. Oh, Dilmar, maybe no, we take the yigalenu when we use it as a miyut, as an exclusion. Yigalenu lazeh v'lo la'acher, the relatives redeem this individual who sold to the non-Jew, but not if he sold to the Jew. Tashman, the Gemara says, come and hear the following proof to this question by an Eved Ivri that sold to the Jew, whether nigal lekrovim or not. B'chol geula titnu. Again, the pasuk says that b'chol eretz achuz aschem geula titnu, that you're going to have redemption by all. L'rabos batan v'Eved Ivri. This is what we quoted above. It includes houses and Eved Ivri. And so my lav is it not? Batei arechoma ve'Eved Ivri hanimkar liYisrael. As we said above, doesn't it mean to include the houses in the walled cities? But we also mentioned the Eved Ivri that's sold to the Jew. It seems to be including even an Eved Ivri who sold to the Jew is going to have this halacha of redemption by relatives. And the Gemara says in the low, no, not necessarily. Eved Ivri hanimkar la'ovet kol chavim. It could be when the Brisa says that b'chol geula titnu includes Eved Ivri, it's an Eved Ivri that's sold to a non-Jew. That's where we say the relatives redeem. Gemara says, how could you say that? Eved Ivri hanimkar la'ovet kol chavim. If you have an Eved Ivri that's sold to a non-Jew, behed yaksiv bey. That's already an explicit pasuk. We already mentioned that earlier. O dodo vendodo yigalenu. It says again, his uncle's going to come, his son of his uncle's going to come. They're going to redeem. So we already know that you have redemption by relatives in that case. You wouldn't need to learn it out from b'chol geula titnu. We will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis.